Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's special pop-up webinar is titled Consolatio, Coping with a Collapsing World. I'm very pleased to be joined by Mike Fontaine from Cornell University and Richard Fontaine from the Center for New American Security. My name is Andy Mink. I am the Vice President of Education at the Center. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I think this is a first. I don't think we've ever had brothers lead a webinar for us before. I'm really excited to bring both Richard and Michael's perspectives to what is an increasingly complicated world. I also want to thank all of you for joining us on yet another Zoom or Skype or webinar or web-based event of some kind. I'm sure that all of you are increasingly sick of being in this environment, but it does provide us a pretty unique opportunity to join in conversation with educators and scholars from literally all over the world. I was scrolling through the attendees list tonight and looking at the chat box where many of you are introducing yourself, and as always, just very pleased to see folks from all over the country. We've got Andres from Puerto Rico joining us again tonight, and if I'm not mistaken, we've got someone from Morocco. Chafik, welcome. I'm so glad that you could join us from the other side of the world. The intent here is really for you also to converse with each other, so please do take advantage of that chat box as a way to share thoughts, share resources, respond with questions, share with each other the kinds of ways in which you tackle these same issues in your own teaching or in your own life. And it's a way for us to ideally inspire that between us. I also want to thank, as I always do, Libby Taylor and Mike Williams. These are wonderful members of my education team. Libby's our primary contact with our scholars in terms of developing the readings and the PowerPoints and working with you, our audience. Mike runs our online course catalog, and both have done a fabulous job this year. This is our second to last webinar in a 40-session series this year. And we've been just so pleased that that both of them have been able to contribute in so many meaningful ways. The center, like all of your schools and organizations and communities, is currently closed. We're located in Durham, North Carolina. Unfortunately, if you go to the center right now, it'll be dark and somewhat dusty. But you can visit all the content that we create and that we share. That's primarily through our website. The URL is at the bottom of your screen. Please do take some time to visit the website to see the kind of work that our fellows and the scholars that we work with and support have created. You can also access our education materials here. And so really the most powerful function in that vertical navigation is the search bar. And so if you go in, all of our material has been indexed and tagged and discoverable with each other. So if you go to this site and you typed in, for example, Mike Fontaine's name, because he's a great classicist who's done work with us before, you'll find not only a podcast that he created several years ago on how to think like a 21st century classicist, a recording of a previous webinar that he's done with us, as well as some other writings. Or maybe you are more interested in trying to understand how the humanities can help with loss. We just recently published this essay that was written by Matthew Booker. Matthew is a historian at North Carolina State University and has just joined our senior staff as the vice president of our scholarly programs. And it's a very concise and clear articulation, I think, of how the humanities can help us get through these kinds of tough times. Both of those items you can find on our website, as well as many other, according to the search that you initiate. Excuse me. I would encourage all of you to consider joining the team as part of our Teacher Advisory Council. Each year we welcome and invite somewhere between 15 and 20 educators from across the country. We ask them to come and work with us as contributing members of our council. It's important for us that our work become and remain relevant and connected to the classroom. I would like to think that the burden isn't overwhelming. We've got many of our both past and current TAC members in the room with us tonight. I see Katie Willett there in Charlotte, North Carolina, Karen Baranek in Bering Strait, Alaska, many others, Ron Eisenman up in Vermont. I don't think that the annual commitment is that burdensome, but it does include a 2-day trip to North Carolina to spend some time at the center with us and letting us share with you the work that we do and introduce you to the folks that you'll advocate for. For that reason, one of the components of your application will be a letter of support by your direct supervisor or principal or administrator. And that's primarily to make sure that in October, when we invite you to Durham, they know you're coming and they can't turn you down and turn down your sub request. Please do get your applications into us by May 22nd, and we'll make announcements likely in the first part of June. I also want to announce that we have 3 online courses that are currently open and we'll be accepting registrations. Each of these courses is worth 35 professional development hours. Of course, that translates differently in different states and districts. I can tell you that many states have pre-approved these courses. Los Angeles Unified has pre-approved these courses for salary points and for certification credits. So we still have plenty of spots left, and we'd love to see any of you join any of these courses. And then finally, I want to remind you that at the end of July, we'll be hosting a 5-day face-to-face institute called Beyond February, Hip Hop and the African American Experience. We'll be working with performance artist and University of Virginia music professor A.D. Carson on ways in which hip hop can help us access the African American experience and better understand it as we work with kids and make curricular decisions. Right now, that event is still happening. It's a live face-to-face event. By the end of July, fingers crossed, we've begun to safely reopen and we're able to spend time together. But of course, we would update you if that changes for any reason. Finally, tonight's webinar, as many of you know, I recognize so many names in the room from previous sessions. Tonight's session is a audio only webinar. You'll hear my voice and you'll hear both Mike and Richard's voices. You'll see an associated PowerPoint, but your chat is going to be very important. And so I really do encourage you to respond and ask questions and ask for clarifications and make comments in that chat box. My job as the moderator is to pull that into our conversation. But again, we've got a tag team tonight. So either Mike or Richard, whoever's not the primary speaker at the time, will also be in the chat box, answering questions, making comments, maybe fleshing out some of the points that we're making in the webinar. Thank you again for joining, everyone. I want you to know that we appreciate your attendance, and I'm really pleased to be able to bring Michael Fontaine from Cornell and Richard Fontaine from the Center for New American Security to our session tonight. So Mike, let me go ahead and open up your microphone. Richard, I'm gonna open up yours as well. And I'm gonna, you guys grew up in the same house, so you'll know how to not step on each other when you're talking. But hey, welcome guys. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Andy. Yep. It's wonderful to be back. I'm really excited to be here with you. So thank you. And Richard?
See, already they're jockeying for position. Mike, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Hello, Mike. Pause just 1 second. I'll tell you what, just as a way of checking the audio, I can't hear Mike right now, but I wonder if anybody else can. And if you can, put it in the chat box. You can hear him, but I can't, then it's going to be an issue in my microphone.
No. Can anybody hear me if I speak?
No, we can't hear you, Mike. Michelle, you can hear everyone. Yes, you can hear him. Okay, hold on 1 second, Mike. Let me see what's happening with my microphone. I might have to unplug. Hello.
It's Mike again. Can you hear me, Andy?
There you go. I can hear you now. Hey, Mike.
All right, super. So thanks for having us back.
Hey, sorry about that. Yeah, sorry about that. Just a little bit of negotiating the audio, but thank you for being patient with me.
No problem. No, thanks very much for having me. Some folks here may have even been present when I gave one of these webinars a couple of years ago, and it was really a wonderful experience. I'm excited to be back. And the National Humanities Center does terrific stuff for all of us. I think many of us are educators, not all of us, but certainly many of us. Richard, do you want to introduce yourself a bit?
Sure. Well, I am the boss at this think tank in Washington, so not probably a typical participant in one of these sessions. And it's called the Center for New American Security, CNAS. We are a national security and foreign policy think tank that focuses on the big issues of the day. So whether it's in Asia or the Middle East or Europe, or defense issues or some of the economic and diplomatic issues that we focus on. That's what we do. And we do research and publications and things like that, all with a policy focus. I would say two things. One of my, a bee in my bonnet has been that policymakers should draw upon not only policy literature and policy knowledge, but also knowledge of the humanities, and in particular, literature and fiction. And so it's really a pleasure to be part of this tonight. And then second, perhaps the most important feature of my biography is that I am the brother of Michael Fontaine. And when we were both growing up together, we didn't envision that one day we would be participating in an event like this. And so it's a real honor to be with him.
Well, thanks, Richard. The reason I did ask you here specifically is because we live sort of different lives. As it says here on the bio, I'm a professor of classics at Cornell, which is obviously a wonderful appointment. I've been here for 16 years, but it's precisely because I don't always feel the real world effects of what we're studying in the classroom that I think it's important to try and bring in, for lack of a better word, the real world perspectives. What does it mean when we're discussing ideas and then we take them out and put them into practice? So let me start up our slideshow. This should work. I think I have control. Here we go. Let's see. Okay, so I had a description here. Let me just pull this back out. The description of our webinar, I want to recap for everybody, is one that I wrote up quickly when Andy said, the world is changing. Do the ancients have things to say about this? And I said, boy, do they. So we gave it the title Consolatio, which is Latin for consolation, coping with a collapsing world. And it says, all things change, say the philosophers, but sometimes they change more dramatically than we're ready for. Ancient Greek, Roman, Jewish, and Christian writers developed a number of practical strategies for coping with sudden illness, loss, and death. So in this webinar, we're going to explore two of those strategies. The first is the consolation, that's a technical term, which looks to the future, and the thanksgiving, which looks to God. And I call out a few focus authors that we're going to get to. What's interesting, or I hope for you tonight, is that I am in the field of classics, which that's with a capital C, refers to the study of ancient Greece and Rome largely before Christianity became part of the Roman world. And so, but what's interesting is that Greece and Rome and Judaism and Christianity, to a large extent, were all within the same empire. So as a best practice these days in classics, we're trying to extend to look at contemporary developments across the Mediterranean world. So we're going to get to those in a minute, but I wanted to queue up an article that you published, Richard, just the other day on the internet. I was surprised to find a foreign policy wonk publishing a paper that says to prepare for a crisis, read fiction. And this is what you wrote. Here's a quote I pulled out. I just want to read it for the audience, and then maybe you can explain it a bit. You said every discipline, psychology, economics, biology, history, examines the world through a particular prism. Yet only fiction invites us inside the minds of others, transports us across time and place, and produces in us a kind of experience we could otherwise never attain. By enmeshing us in its characters and stories, reading fiction helps policymakers better understand the human condition and more ably fashion responses to it. I want to know, by the way, what some of you in the audience think of that. Just tell us in the chat box. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And then you say novels hone the powers of observation and insight. They increase mental flexibility and they help policymakers anticipate situations. They illuminate other mindsets, cultures, places, and times. The best ones induce a sense of empathy in their readers, and they help render policy approaches more effective and more humane. So I've got a lot of thoughts about that, but I want to, maybe you could explain a bit. Rich?
Sure. Well, it was an unusual article for me to write. Normally, like the other folks who are in the policy world, I'm writing pieces about what we should do with China or Europe or the Middle East or the post-pandemic world or any of these other kinds of things. But actually, as the coronavirus crisis dawned and it became clear to me that there's a very necessary and right reliance on all of the science that underlies what the approach should be. Like with all policies, there's a danger of losing a bit of the human side, the empathy that goes along with making decisions that can affect millions of people. And that's always a danger among policymakers. I worked for 10 years in the government before I went to CNAS, and one of the things that always struck me was I worked for a while at the National Security Council staff at the White House, and in the old executive office building on the White House compound, there was a library. This is back when people read these things called books that actually were printed on paper and bound and things like that. And I would go there from time to time to check out books, novels or history books. And I was almost always the only person in there. And, policymakers are great readers. They read all the time. They read all the news. They read policy papers all the time. They read studies. They read journal articles. They read memos. They read intelligence reports if you're in the national security field. But it's actually pretty rare for policymakers to read fiction. And I think that's a big missing piece. And the danger of a policymaker is that they always get cloistered, that they're making decisions that affect people without really understanding their potential impact on the human condition. And whether it's because of its ability to increase our empathetic sense or to expand the boundaries of what we think is possible and be able to think the otherwise unimaginable and increase our mental nimbleness, or for any other reason, I think fiction is a vital component of the policymaker sort of intellectual toolkit. And so after this was published, I got a very small minority of responses of people saying, yeah, that's why I read fiction all the time too. And then I got quite a few people saying, oh, I guess I should pick up a novel and start reading again. I haven't read, much in the last 20 years or something. So.
Well, so what you wrote here is both music to, I think, the ears of most of us here. I'm seeing all kinds of agreement in the chat box. I think this is the dream of humanities educators, right? That this actually is going to make policymakers, think better, be more empathetic. I see a lot of people saying that fiction is a safe opportunity to encounter others, to imagine ourselves. And it's also totally depressing, as you say, that they're not doing it very much. So it's good and it's bad. It sounds like we've got a lot more work to do. So I was struck when you wrote this, and I wonder if anybody can, if anybody else is getting the same idea. But if you were to go back to the ancient world, this is sort of my expertise, you would find someone saying almost the same thing. So when I talk about classics or ancient Greece, we have got to go a long, long, long way back. If you go back 100 years in the United States, women got the right to vote. If you go back 155 years, that was the end of the Civil War. If you go back 400 and change, or call it 500 years, and 525 years, you're at Columbus. We got to go 2,000 years before Columbus to get to the point that I want to get to. So let me show you this next slide. What I'm talking about is Aristotle, the famous Greek philosopher. So Aristotle was interested in Greek tragedy. Now in ancient Greece, they didn't really have novels. There are a couple from later times, but not really the kind we know of. But what the Greeks had was theater, right? If they had movie cameras, these would all be movies. But they didn't have cameras, so they had theaters, stone theaters, and you go and sit there. And they had two kinds, right? They had comedy, which is funny, and they had tragedy, which is where horrible things happen. And look at what Aristotle says here. This is from his Poetics. He says, a tragedy is the imitation of an action that is serious and also is having magnitude, that is, say it's a big deal. It's complete all by itself, with incidents that arouse pity and fear. And that allows it to accomplish its catharsis of those emotions, its purging of those emotions. So the idea is that when you watch a tragedy, it's exactly as you, and I think many of us would say, you empathize with these people trapped in these situations. And the audience feels the twin emotions of pity and fear. You either feel compassion or empathy, or you're afraid. And by watching this, and in a sort of safe space, as I saw a few people saying in the chat box, it's yes, like Schadenfreude, sort of, yes. This is exactly how we can get rid of some of the stresses of our daily life. So it's interesting. I think you're right that it's going to make policymakers make better choices, make all of us make better choices. But it's also an opportunity to de-stress by exploring some of those emotions. I see people saying, yeah, it's therapeutic, models, all that. This is wonderful. Let me show you a couple more ideas here. On this next slide. Okay, yeah, so that's great if you're reading a novel and you have the leisure to sit down and do it, but it's precisely people like you, Richard, that maybe don't always have to do that when you're trying to make decisions in real time. I know that years ago you were when you were a foreign policy advisor to John McCain, you were trying to make some serious decisions, war, aid to foreign countries, all this sort of stuff. You don't always have time to think about it. So what happens in real life? And this is where, whoops, let's go back a slide. I want to look at a famous incident that everybody listening could read, and I asked you to read a bit of, with your students or with your family or friends. So in the year 430 BCE, the city of Athens, which was in a war at the time, was struck by a plague. And that's the plague, nobody's quite sure what it was. There's different ideas, but the plague was absolutely horrible. People were getting deathly sick, dying in huge numbers. It was contagious. The doctors couldn't do anything. Nobody knew what was causing it. There were all sorts of conspiracy theories about where it had come from. People were blaming various other nations for having released the plague, not on purpose, but it came from there. And what happened was a famous historian. Anybody know the name of this historian that wrote about the plague in Athens in 430? He's very famous in Washington, D.C. He's like a patron saint of politics. Yes, I see it popping up. Christine, yeah, Maureen, Martha, everybody's got Thucydides, yes. So Thucydides lived through this thing. He not only lived through the war, but he lived through the plague. And he wrote up a literary account that set the template for basically the way Western literature has always conceived of plagues. The different emotions that arise when these plagues strike, how you regard other people, what it feels like to live through them, how you cope with something you can't. So I'm showing you, these are slides from a Justice League of America comic book from 5 years ago that did a little number on it. And you can see here that most believe the gods had abandoned them. Thucydides says this. You're seeing it today. You see it in every one of these things. Rich, I know that you were talking about Camus and the plague in that same piece. Did you have thoughts about this?
Yeah, one of the, there's so much that goes into the writings about a plague, either from Thucydides or through Camus, which if you haven't read The Plague, by Camus, it's a wonderful novel. I'm not sure now is the right time for everybody to read it, but it's very good. And both of these kinds of works and other ones as well bring out some really latent aspects of human nature when confronted with these kinds of upheavals. And so, the tendency of humans to continue to try to do things that they've always done just because that's what they've done. In The Plague by Camus, people still dress up and go to the theater as the numbers in the city continue to dwindle as their family members are dying, things like that. Some people try to do what they can do, no matter, and serve, even, there's echoes from Thucydides through Camus all the way to the grocery store workers that we're all praising now, who do what they do because that's what you can do during an upheaval. But this clinging to the way things are, and then this uncertainty about what is going to unfold afterwards, I think is a thread that runs through a lot of the writings. I mean, there's also other writings on this kind of stuff, The Mask of the Red Death by Poe and other things like that. And so you see some of these works highlight some of the basics of human nature that I think, looking back at Thucydides and onward, haven't changed at all in more than 2,000 years.
That's right. And the responses are what's so interesting. What you're saying about Camus, right? We're seeing similar pressures now. People want to get back to normal as fast as possible. I mean, I don't know anyone who doesn't want to get back to normal. Within safe bounds and so on. I see some other, by the way, lots of good reads are being popped up in the chat box here. I hope people are taking a look at these. One thing Thucydides was famous for was he said the human condition doesn't change. Human nature doesn't really change. It just, people, 1,000 years before me were the way they are going to be 1,000 years later. And of course, people agree or disagree about that point. But for this webinar, I didn't assign Thucydides' own account. I gave him a different account that was picked up by a famous poet of ancient Rome, and that was Lucretius. Have any of you read Lucretius? He was the poet of Epicurean thought, of philosophy in ancient Rome about 2,000 years ago. Yes, I see. Christine's got Lucretius. Oh, good. That really is wonderful. Exactly. De rerum natura. And so Thucydides gives, Lucretius writes an epic poem about the way the universe is. His title would mean something like the way reality is. And he begins with the movement of atoms swirling around in the universe. And the entire end of the whole book is about death. It ends in this horribly bleak, really discouraging reading about people fighting. And their main reaction, in Lucretius's telling, he highlights that the reaction is mostly despair. And for Lucretius and for Thucydides and everyone, they're going to say this is sort of the basic reaction, right? If you can't pull yourself together, you get nothing but sheer despair, and you just freak out and you can't do anything about it. So this is a condition that's going to be, this is the base condition of total collapse. And Lucretius, his whole poem is dedicated to showing you that there's no life after death, or trying to convince you of this. And so it's sort of the test. The epic ends with a test. Can you really read something this horrible and pronounce yourself indifferent to that fate? And so it's provoked all kinds of, oh yeah, I see some recommendations here. Some of you read Lucretius in grad school, Stephen Greenblatt's The Swerve. Yes. Can you read this text and be unaffected by it? And so this is an entryway into some of the ancient reactions. There are other reactions to societal collapse, and I gave one a story that I assume most people know, the story of Noah. Now, I wonder, did any of you know before we read this what Noah did after he got out of the ark? Right, so God floods the world. Everything on planet Earth dies except the ones cramped on that boat. Yes, some of you knew this. This is great. All right, so he goes into the winemaking business. He got drunk, yes, but more importantly, he becomes a vintner. He decides to plant grapes, and this becomes the origin story of where wine comes from, which is all around the ancient Mediterranean. But yes, it also becomes the first story of substance abuse. So look at what's happening right now. I'm not going to ask you to volunteer in the chat box, but I wonder if you're seeing similar reactions in your circuits, that sales of alcohol have gone through the roof. From liquor stores. Of course, they're down overall, I'm reading, because people are not going to restaurants. Are you seeing that in Washington, Richard? I hate to ask.
Well, yeah, I mean, everybody is talking about how they, in fact, one of my colleagues was just telling me how she's moved from 1 margarita per night to 2 and considered it essential. And then I have a friend who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania who was absolutely apoplectic that the state-run liquor stores were not considered essential services, at least for a while. So that was the most emotional I've heard him get about almost anything.
So everybody's, whether out of boredom or out of depression, and people are all starting to get kind of worried about that. I see Cinco de Mayo. That's a little different. Okay, but here is what happens. This is from this picture here is from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So of course, if you get a chance, when we all get a chance to go back to Rome and hopefully take a look at this. So I see the question, is this a false coping mechanism? Well, I'm not sure that it's false, but it is a coping mechanism that you might pronounce good or bad, but it's one of the most common ones. If you go back to Homer's Odyssey, you find this also, that the veterans coming back with Odysseus after being away for 10 years at a war, they eat the lotus, which seems to be some psychoactive drug, and they don't want to go back home. They prefer to forget themselves. In this picture here, what do we see? Noah is planting his vineyard, and then here, Michelangelo has depicted this incredible vat, and this is Noah getting drunk. And this is typically explained as, sort of substance abuse reaction. And as I said, this is another stat. Oh, this is another depiction of Noah you could show your students. But here are the numbers from that article that I pulled, drinking through the pandemic. Look at this. There are some of the stats. Wine is up 27.5%. Hard liquor, 26.5%. Everything's up. The boxed wine is way up. There are jokes going around about boxed wine being great because you can't measure it by the glass. So those are the coping mechanisms we probably don't want to encourage. But now those are ancient alongside everything else, and the ancients were aware of that. So how else can we cope?
Mike, before you move to how else we cope, we should note for the audience that you are the translator of a now best-selling book that has just been released called How to Drink. So pot meet kettle is all I'm going to say here. So
Well, that
this is being
Rich,
reviewed all over the place. How to drink, very well timed, and you might say a word about the translation you've done there, but I don't know how many people will hold you personally responsible for the statistics you just cited.
well, it is true. I did just, I have a book that just came out. It's a translation of a lost Renaissance treatise on how to drink responsibly. Very funny. Maybe we could talk about it a bit later. But let's get to some of the philosophy. Let me ask you real quick before I show the next slide. What does the word cope? Put this in the chat, please. What does cope mean to you? Let me see some synonyms or some images. To deal with, handle, yeah. Manage, survive, cope, survive. Struggle. Now that's interesting. Okay, get through. Handle it, cope, deal, subsist. Yes, these are all what I think I would agree with all of these. Subsist is very interesting. Make it. These all sound passive, right? They sound like just eking out a way through. But that's not what the original idea of coping was. Take a look at this from the dictionary. The original idea comes from this word in Greek, kolophos, which means to smack somebody on the ear, to cuff them on the ear. And it passed into Latin, as you can see, where it gets mixed up with the Latin word culpa, which means blame or guilt or fault. And so the original idea of coping with something was a violent resistance. And you're going to see how this becomes, this is stronger in the ancient tradition than I think it has become today. Exactly, smacking someone on the head, deal with it. Smack somebody else on the head. So how did the ancients cope? I want to start with a passage here. Well, okay, the first idea would be resilience. And this is the libertarian dream, right? That we can all do this all on our own. We don't need any help. That's for other people. Take a look at this. Now, Cicero, some of you will know this, maybe some others won't. Cicero was the consul of ancient Rome. This is Marcus Tullius Cicero. The consul with a capital C doesn't mean what it means anymore. It means president. Now, in ancient Rome, there were 2 presidents every year, and Cicero got to be one of them. So he was the head of state, chief executive, commander-in-chief of the army. In his retirement, he wrote philosophy, and what he did was he popularized huge trains of Greek philosophy. And here's a passage from a book that is very rarely read today, the Tusculan Disputations. Take a look at this. Now, this is an older translation, but it still makes sense. He says, like I said before, the philosophers all have one method of cure, so that we need say nothing about what sort of thing it is that disturbs the mind, but we must speak only concerning the perturbation itself, only the damaged mindset itself. Thus, first, with regard to desire, when the business is only to remove that, the inquiry is not to be whether that thing is good or evil that provokes lust, but the lust itself is to be removed. Now, this is a little crabbed, but digested. What he's saying is the external stimulus. There's no point arguing whether an external stimulus is good or bad that arouses negative emotions in us. Removing the stimulus isn't going to work. He's saying all the philosophers agree that the negative emotions themselves have to be removed. So the individual stimulus is not enough. And so how are you going to get rid of this negative mindset, what he calls the perturbations? Let's take a look. He says virtue consists in a settled and uniform affection of mind. Virtue can be defined in a few words to be right reason itself. So in this context, he's saying virtue is reason, thinking logically. Its opposite is what he calls, it's hard to find a good translation, he calls faultiness, vitiositas. He says that is what gives rise to these perturbations. Illogicality maybe, that introduce piercing and anxious cares and afflict and debilitate the mind through fear. They violently inflame our hearts with exaggerated appetite, which, should it even attain the object of its wishes, immediately becomes so elated that it loses all its resolution and knows not what to pursue. Virtue then alone can effect the cure of these evils. So this is a fairly profound passage. I see a question, the opposite of veritas, the opposite of truth. Maybe not in this context, though perhaps in others. What is he saying? On my reading, I think he's talking pretty much like the boom or bust attitudes that we see today. We notice all the same behaviors and attitudes, but we tend to have different words for them. So here he's saying you fly from extreme depression or dejection into elation or flights of joy, and then you immediately lapse back into depression and confusion and so on. And his cure is what? He says virtue. And for him in this context, virtue is going to mean reason, talking people out of negative emotions. And I don't know if this is going to work or not, but this is sort of a different attitude than we sometimes see today. What do you think about that, Richard? You got thoughts?
I think that it's a good theory because, and it works to some degree. Well, it works to some degree, right? But, you know, it is not often the case that knowing something intellectually itself changes the emotion that is attached to whatever the stimulus is, right? So, you know, you may know that the chances of dying in a plane crash are lower than the chances that you'll get killed in a car crash driving to the airport. But emotionally, you are scared. Some people are scared of flying more than they're scared of driving, right? And you can tell them the probabilities that attach to these various outcomes, and that it is not a reasonable fear by the sheer odds of being killed or hurt. But it's an emotional reaction. So to some degree, you can control the emotions through reason, but not, unfortunately, completely.
Well, and I see Christine agrees with you. So much of social learning theory, where it just disappeared, demonstrates that reason often doesn't change behavior. I think most of us would say that, yeah, in our moments of terror and panic, yeah, talking somebody about the odds doesn't make them feel better. But this is where the ancient philosophers were adamant. They said, no, you're still thinking wrong about this. To become the sage, the wise person, the Stoic master, this is very hot right now, Stoicism, or almost the Zen master, right? That you can master your emotions by thinking rationally about this. And for better or worse, this is what they try to do. But what I want to do is start with the idea of straight, pure resilience with a text that is absolutely fascinating. Nobody reads today. This is I think it's one of the last ones I asked you to read. Whoops, here we go. It's called the Psychomachia of Prudentius. Now, Prudentius was a Christian author from Spain in the 5th century, who wrote this fascinating text. He's really the first serious Christian poet in the Western tradition, and he was much influenced by Virgil's Aeneid. And so I gave you the translation here. Psychomachia means, so the machia means a battle, right? And psycho means mind or soul. And the modern English might be mind. So it means a battle of your mind, in your mind, for your mind. And he sort of builds off of this ancient idea of virtues fighting against vices or against faulty mindsets. And what makes this text so fascinating is that in Latin, as in other languages, in most other languages, the nouns all have gender, right? And the abstract nouns in Latin all have feminine gender. So he writes a short epic poem of the virtues, that is to say the reason, overcoming the vices in violent warfare. And I gave you a sample of some of these in the reading for the webinar. I did this in a couple of columns I did for Psychology Today. The first one is faith versus worship of the old gods. And he says, this is how we're going to overcome emotional turmoil. And here it's in a sort of, if you squint, it's Christian, but if you don't squint, he's really talking about psychology and managing addictions. So he says, faith represents our trust and hope in our new ways. The old gods represent the old mindset, the habits, the patterns, and the enablers we've resolved to leave behind. So look at how he writes about this. This is coping for him. Faith is the first to appear on the field, to face the uncertainty of this conflict. Her rough dress is disheveled, her shoulders are bare, her long hair is untrimmed, and her arms are uncovered. The glow on her skin is caused by the prospect of sudden and unexpected battle. She burns to enter new contests. She ignores the demands of armor. Faith puts her confidence in her strong heart and arms. She scorns the danger of hand-to-hand combat and intends to destroy her foe by exhausting him. And so what do? That doesn't happen. The first adversary approaches faith. It is worship of the old gods, who proposes to accept the challenge. But faith strikes the enemy's head and it tumbles in the dirt where it lies, with its beribboned brows and the wide mouth that ate the warm red flesh of beasts. And the poetry here is spectacular, right? I mean, the poet is saying, if you want to cope with bad habits, this is what I wrote in the column. If you want to break your bad habits, you have to literally cut them off at the neck. I said, you don't hide the cigarettes or the cookies, or you throw them on the ground and you stomp on them. And that's what faith ends up doing in this thing. So this is a case study in sort of sheer resilience. So what do we think? Does that work? Cold turkey. For people that it works for, it works great. Exactly. I see Amelia say it might work for some. The problem is, yeah, when it works for some of us, we think it should work for all of us, but that's clearly not the case. And when the whole society can collapse around you, it can get really hard to do this on your own. Cicero, among others, of course, knew this. Let me skip over some of these slides I had and get to Cicero. So in that same text, the Tusculan Disputations, what if you just can't do it on your own for whatever reason? And he has a fascinating passage here. Cicero says, people whose grief is so great that they are falling to pieces and cannot hold together should be supported by all kinds of assistance. That is why the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus thinks grief is called lupe, since it's a dissolution of the whole person. So what I've given you here, this is actually a bit of a trick of translation. Those of you who know Greek and Latin are going to say, wow, that's not really exactly right, but it's close, right? The idea is that grief is a total dissolution of the whole person. And I fear that some of us are going to be seeing more of this in the coming days. I hesitate to ask Richard, but are you seeing it with layoffs around DC and this sort of thing?
Yeah, unfortunately. And there's, I was going to ask you about how transferable you think that brief analysis is of the situation we're in now, simply because there's been a lot of things written in the past few weeks about this generalized feeling of uneasiness that so many of us have, not those who have lost a parent to coronavirus, God forbid, or even been laid off and have anxiety about how the bills are going to be paid, but just this generalized feeling of anxiety about what's happening and what the world is going through right now. And a lot of people are identifying that as grief. It's grief not only for individuals who are getting sick or dying, or grief for those who are losing their jobs or suffering some misfortune, but grief for the world that we're leaving behind. We don't know what the world that we're heading into will be, how close it will be to the one we've left behind, but there'll be some differences. And that creates this emotion of grief and this sense of uneasiness that things are changing without a lot of solidity to be able to hold on to as we make this transition. We're in this liminal space between the past and the future. And I wonder whether you think that is a fair assessment of what Cicero is talking about here, and also a fair assessment of where we are right now.
You know, in a way, we're a bit isolated from a lot of it here in a college town where everybody's been sent home. And it's really hard to get a read on what it's like in bigger cities. I know many of the participants here tonight are coming from all different places, so I'm sure your experience is different from mine. I live in a dinky little college town, and when the campus closed, half of the people disappeared. And so it's very hard to get a sense of what it's like. And you're quite right, though, the unease of what's coming next. And this is where maybe some of the ancient ideas might be helpful. Given that there's very little else to look to. Let me explore a couple of these things with you. Notice that Cicero says when people are falling to pieces, they need all kinds of assistance. And he's adamant, again, the philosophers are adamant that virtue, however defined, is going to be the way to do it. So his basic idea, again, anything short of talk therapy for the ancients would be a drug. They don't want you drinking wine. They don't want you taking drugs. Of course, the Greeks had opium. The Romans had opium. They had all the same stuff. So they work through talk therapy. And that brings us to the consolatio, the consolation. Let's see if I can get that slide. Here we go. I want to work through a little bit about what Cicero says. This is a famous passage in that same book. He says, grief, he means specifically when someone dies, grief is the greatest affliction. In order that once we have got rid of that, it may appear a business of less consequence to look after remedies for the others. There are certain things which are usually said about poverty, meaning there are treatises, talk therapy treatises, self-help books, you might say, about poverty, and also certain statements applied to retired and undistinguished life. Those are the ones we don't have today. We don't have consolations from the ancient world about how to cope with poverty. We don't have the ancient treatises on, we do have one on being retired, Cicero himself does, or living an undistinguished life. I think that's the one many of us would like to have, as our social lives are changing. There are treatises on banishment or exile, on the ruin of one's country, on slavery, on disability, on blindness, and on every incident that can come under the name of an evil, basically every problem. And he says there's an appropriate consolation for all of these things. So what I want to show you now are some modern scholars. There we go. This is from Brills Poly. Some of you may know this. This is a major research encyclopedia for classics. They've gone through everything we have, the remains, and they say about the wide range of themes that I just told you about. Only those on exile and the occasion of bereavement, of someone dying, stand out clearly. Those are the ones we have left. And it cites a few of them here. Exile, in Seneca, Musonius Rufus, he was a Stoic, and Plutarch. But these all reflect sort of Greek precursors. And the central thought, the logical thought that we need to persuade you of to feel better is that a change of abode is no evil in itself. So even if you're forced to move out of your house and move to a crummy house in another town, that's no evil in itself. And even with the disadvantages of poverty and degradation that frequently accompany it, it should not dismay a person, a man of understanding. What do you think about that, Richard?
Yeah, when I read this, it really struck a parallel with the way folks are thinking about our current situation, because if you are bereaved, then you are deprived of something, right? You're stripped, divested of something. You're left without something that you hold dear, right? And of course, we are used to thinking about this when a family member dies or a friend dies or something like that. And as horrible as that is, it's fairly straightforward to understand the emotions that attach to those kinds of experiences. And as some people have been saying in the chat box here, civilization has developed rituals to help deal with the passage of those who are bereaved to a new existence without the thing that they lost, the person that they lost, the funeral, things like that. And of course, at this moment, we're deprived of almost all of our rituals. So people are trying to keep up the rituals by virtually having Zoom conversations and funerals and things like that. But there's this broader sense of bereavement, that the world, the order that we knew that ordered our lives is being altered at a very quick pace. And so, in the words here, we are changing, we're all changing abode, right? We're changing from the abode that we were in before. We're in this space now, and we will have a new abode in the future. And of course, we can't say whether that's going to be better, whether it's going to be worse, how different it will be. But I think the underlying uncertainty that is attached to that itself is an emotional driver of all these kinds of things. So this gets me back to I guess some of the skepticism about the degree to which reason and talking people logically out of their emotional responses can sort of do all of the trick. It can certainly be a consolation, but it's not going to be 100% consolation.
All right. Well, I think Plutarch is ahead of you on this point. So let me get ahead to him. No, I agree. The uncertainty is awful, but the grief, you're going to, we'll show you in a minute here. Whoops. I'll show you in just a minute here that they're going to talk about the value of grieving and whether we should do it at all. And it's going to be very alien to the way I think many of us are dealing with these things today. I see some terrible, terrible news here in the chat box about a student who passed away from the coronavirus. This is awful. All right, I mean, so these things are real. This is happening. A friend of mine in England just told me two friends of a friend of his just passed away. So these are things that we're going to have to be dealing with now. So let's see what they have to say. I have a couple slides. If you wanted to truly drill down, you could find out sort of where these ideas come from. These are the different schools of Hellenistic philosophy. They're not really relevant here, but what the encyclopedia article is telling us here is that each of these, in the consolations that exist, they all sort of incorporate these ideas. So the first one, the Peripetos, came up with the idea of moderate sorrow. In other words, you shouldn't completely devolve in sorrow over any loss, no matter how bad it is. You cannot allow yourself to completely fall apart. Plato's Academy came up with the idea that the death released the soul of its earthly toil and led it to a better life. Now that's an idea that I think might be familiar to many people today. Plato, much of Christianity, for example, shares ideas with Platonism. Epicureanism, which is Lucretius, that we read at the beginning, has this will sound familiar too, its methods of distraction and the recalling of pleasing aspects and activities. So you want to find other activities, other hobbies that will take your mind off things. And you want to dwell on the happy memories and not the bad. I'm guessing this will sound fairly familiar to people as well. The Stoa, again, came with the idea of scorning fortune. They said, well, it's irrelevant to being happy. That's probably the hardest one to accept. And the last one is the most familiar to classicists, was this idea of the premeditatio malorum, rehearsing problems. Prepare yourself for problems. So even at the height of your happiness, get ready for a change because you know it's coming. You think that would help, Richard? Or folks in the chat, tell us, do you think that practicing for awful things would actually make you feel better at the moment?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure folks in the chat box can offer their views on that. I'm sure to some degree. I mean, I think if nothing else, imagining the deprivation that attends bereavement can make you value much more the things that you have and so often take for granted. You know, there's a somewhat cynical but probably effective psychological admonishment that, you know, if your family is driving you crazy, just stop and imagine them not being there for a minute, and suddenly they look, you know, a hell of a lot more fun to hang out with because you're glad they're around. You know, the one thing that
wait, can I interrupt you here? But they actually, so they're prescribing something a little bit different. So it's not just imagine that it could be worse at any moment. It's at the height of your happy times when you're out for a walk with your family. Just tell yourself at that moment, this happiness cannot last. So I need to enjoy it now because I know that it's going to be bad. Things will get worse because I'm so happy now. So it's a little bit different. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do, and I think there's a big exception to this. So I think that, you know, desensitizing yourself or imagining the reality of something bad happening maybe can help you through when that thing happens. The big exception to this, I think, is one's own death, because you know, this gets back to how closely you can apply reason. And as the modern philosophers of death have extrapolated from some of the writers that we're talking about here, but, you know, they will say, for example, that fear of death is, and the anxiety that fear produces is irrational, because, you know, why, for something to be to be afraid of something, it has to be bad. There has to be some sort of negative thing happening, some sort of suffering. Well, in order to suffer, there has to be a time when you suffer. Well, if you're dead, by definition, you don't exist. So there is no suffering that you're doing. It's just the absence of whatever it is while you're alive. So it's not rational to fear something that does not actually involve any suffering. But do you feel better now?
Well, this is precisely what all of the ancient philosophers said. You have got, so we're going to take away your fear of death. And the ancients, they all tried to do this in two different ways. So the ancients before Christianity in Greece and Rome all tried to convince you that death was not a bad thing. And when Christianity came into the Roman Empire, death became a good thing, or it could be a bad thing, but generally it was seen as a good thing. This is our next slide here. So this is a last little bit from an encyclopedia article here, right? So some writings, they say, offer precisely the things you're talking about, Richard. On the one hand, there's been no unsurmountable pain and damage to the bereaved. In other words, when someone that you love dearly, a child, dies, that there's been no unsurmountable pain to the bereaved. In other words, it can be horrible, but you can get past it. And on the other, that for the person who died, that death itself is not a misfortune. It could even be the transition to a better existence. And so what's interesting is that, so the idea that death is a transition to a better existence is not purely Christian or Jewish at all, for that matter, but you see it already in quite a few of the so-called pagan authors. I pulled out a couple passages to look at here. Let me skip over this. This is a slide from Cicero. So the first one is a Stoic view. And this, you and I were talking about this earlier, Richard. See if this, I want to ask folks what they think of this. Seneca is going to try and convince us that death is not a big deal. This is what he says in one of his consolations to Marcia. Consider that the dead are afflicted by no ills. They don't have any problems. And that those things that render the underworld a source of terror are mere fables. He said, nah, come on, the dead people don't have any problems, and there's no such thing as hell. That's all made up. No shadows loom over the dead, no prisons, no rivers blazing with fire, no waters of oblivion. There are no trials, no defendants, no tyrants reigning a second time in that place of unchained freedom. The poets, like Virgil, have devised these things for fun, and they've troubled our minds with empty terrors. And he says, no, death is the undoing of all our problems. It's an end beyond which our ills cannot go. It returns us to that peace in which we reposed before we were born. If someone pities the dead, let him also pity those not yet born. So this is a classic, yeah, it's not very consoling. This is a classic argument made by a number of philosophers, all tracing their roots back to Socrates. The idea, although it's not a Socratic idea, the idea that death is going to be exactly the same as before we were born. So what do you think? Does that make you feel better?
Yeah,
That thought?
Mike and I were talking a little bit earlier, and my view, Seneca's offering a little bit of weak sauce. There's certain logical conclusions with that he draws that I think one has to concur with. You know, for example, if non-existence is by definition the absence of life, then we should feel as much grief for someone not born as someone who's died, right? That you know, I mean, that's part of his argument. Or part of his argument is that, and which I think is true, that life should be measured by quality and not just quantity, right? You know, a life well lived is better than a life lived long, right? And things like that. Nevertheless, there's two components to grief. There's the worry about what happened to the person who has left, who's died, not just the fact that they may be in a worse place than they were on Earth or something like that, but the fact that they were deprived of a life that should have been longer. Why should? It was less than they would have wanted, or that it was average or something. So you worry about their deprivation from the life that on average they would have been expected to enjoy. And then you worry about your own deprivation from your life being led in a world with them. And Seneca can kind of get at the deprivation that someone would go through because he says, well, what a lot of people are being deprived of isn't that great in the first place. You could be a slave, and then it's great because you're dead and you're not a slave anymore. So that's a kind of a net plus. I mean, that's arguable, but he doesn't really, I don't think, do a lot in what he's trying to do in his consolation to Marcia, which is to say you can live the rest of your life without the grief, overpowering grief that attends this loss, because it is an irreducible truth that for the balance of that life, it will be deprived of this person who is loved.
You're right. That's an argument they tend to skirt around. But it does tend to be in Stoicism, and Seneca is the best representative of Stoicism that we have. They reach this cold, cruel logic that is trying specifically, as Cicero originally said, perhaps not in such a inflexible form, that virtue, reason, can convince us that our emotions are irrational and we should therefore ignore them or master them, however we're going to do them. And you're right. I mean, these things aren't equivalent, but you say, well, we don't really know. Let me show you a couple more passages from the same Marcia, Consolation of Marcia. Look what now he goes on to ridicule people. Oh, how ignorant they are of their troubles. Those who do not praise and await death as the finest device of nature. Whether it closes off happiness or drives away disaster, whether it ends the satiety and torpor of the old, or reduces the bloom of youth when better things are looked for, or calls back adolescence before it embarks on harsher paths, it is an end for all and a remedy for many, and for some the answer to a prayer, better deserved by no one more than those to whom it comes before it is summoned. And so this is the kind of logic that it can seem almost sadistic to try and convince someone who's grieving. I find it quite strange. I don't know what others think or what you think, Richard, or people here listening, but this strikes me as cruelty to tell this to someone who's grieving, that death is better than being alive. I see some great thoughts popping up here. I saw one about the Buddhist concept of dukkha. I wish I could pronounce on that. I was good friends with a Buddhist, unfortunately, who was always trying to integrate it with classical philosophy. I don't know enough about it.
Well,
and I see some other ideas.
I can riff a little bit with my not great knowledge of Buddhist thought, but dukkha is this basically translated as suffering. One of the Four Noble Truths, the first one is about dukkha. It's that all life is suffering. Ultimately, suffering comes from attachments, and so the sort of mission of the Buddhist approach is to transcend attachments and therefore eliminate suffering through enlightenment. But there is some parallel, I think, here potentially, because Seneca is emphasizing the portions of life that involve suffering. His remedy for that suffering is death and non-existence, because by definition, if you don't exist, you can't suffer. The Buddhist at least has a more, attractive approach, which is to say you can actually transcend and eliminate that suffering through the Eightfold Path, which is the techniques by which you would eliminate suffering by eliminating the sense of attachment. So I would have to personally go with the Buddhists rather than Seneca. That would be my vote.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm glad you can expound on that. I see the question: did Seneca believe in the transmigration of soul? No, he was.
If I've gotten dukkha wrong, then please correct anything that I said, because I've read a decent amount, but I'm not a Buddhist expert by any stretch.
No, I think it looks like there's some happiness with your answer here, by the way. I see, did Seneca believe in the transmigration of soul? No, the Stoics were a materialist philosophy, meaning when you're gone, you're gone. This is all there is. And that eventually the universe would collapse in heat death, which sounds kind of modern. But Stoicism, it's sort of a new agey sort of creed that was constantly changing. Seneca himself, did not. But there were other, in fact, one of the philosophers I'm going to get to in a moment did. Let me take a look at, I'm going to skip over this last one. from Seneca, and get to another way of looking at a coping strategy for bereavement. So if Seneca's is no good for us, the cold logic chopping of, well, being dead is just like never being born or before you were born. I asked
Mike,
everybody
if I can just come in on one quick point before you go to that. I think just looking at some of the comments in the chat from Martha, who has this reference to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, which is, the discipline of St. Ignatius, and of course it was the Benedictine disciplines. And then, we were talking about, the eightfold path essentially in Buddhism can be construed as a set of disciplines. And, some of the things you were talking about before are a set of disciplines, a set of exercises to imagine, for example, bad things happening as a mental exercise by which to render your psyche more resilient to suffering. All of these things are different ways of essentially stretching the mind, exercising the mind by trying to reduce suffering through different forms of mental exercise, whether it's religious in content like the spiritual exercises of the Catholic monks, or it's mindfulness and meditative practices like the Buddhists, or it's the imagination and envisioning of particular scenarios like Seneca and others are proposing. And I think that it's an interesting thread that they're all coming around to these techniques that are all aimed at the same thing, which is reduce suffering that ultimately comes from attachment, including attachment to other people and to a way of life that when lost, or when you fear that it will be lost, creates this sense of anxiety and pain.
Excellent. Yeah.
It's the first time my brother's ever said excellent, by the way, in anything I've ever said. So I'm gonna hope.
I'm not sure about
it. I'm kidding.
Not at all. No. We do talk. We don't talk enough about them. We should talk more. But all right, so here's one. You had a nice Woody Allen quote, I think, for this. I do. So the Stoic stuff tends to leave a lot of people cold. I don't know if anybody's out on the West Coast. Stoicism apparently is huge in California. I'm not too sure why. People love this stuff. But for most people, that stuff leaves them kind of cold. So as you say, right, for the mental coping, what are some other creative strategies? I asked everybody to read for this thing, for our webinar, a passage from Quintilian. If you've ever heard of this guy, Quintilian, please say so in the chat box. He was the world's first professor of Latin. So he lived in the Roman Empire about 1900 years ago. Very good, Martha, excellent. And he wrote a huge encyclopedia called Educating the Orator, Educating the Public Speaker. And in the beginning of book 6, there's this terrible passage where he says, first, that his wife died. She was only 19. And they'd had 2 kids. The first one had died at the age, I think, of 3, if I'm not mistaken. My memory's right. And then he was quite an old man by then. He seems to have been like in his 80s or 70s or something. So first, his very young wife died. Then the 3-year-old died. And then his 9-year-old son, the only family member he had left, died. And he was almost done writing this masterpiece of, the career book he'd spent his whole career working on. And he has this very touching passage where he says, I was always going to use this book as sort of my legacy to my son. He could learn from it and form his whole career off this thing. But he says, now the only thing that keeps me going in this world, short of, committing suicide, is to finish the book precisely in place of the child. And so this is the coping strategy. I think it might be a little more familiar with today, right? The creative act. Create art, write a book, write an essay, journal, something that you can leave behind. All the poets say this in the ancient world. This is going to be my tombstone. Forget the marble and the brass, but it's going to be a book. And so this is sort of somebody who seems a little more realistic and a little less pointy-headed than Seneca. I don't know. What did you have to say about, what was that quip you had, Richard?
Well, Woody Allen's famous quote about all this was, I don't want to be immortal through my work. I want to be immortal through not dying. Because I guess it's a consolation of a sort to think that when you're, when you're gone, then your writings or your creation or whatever will live after you. But of course, the irreducible reality is you ain't there to enjoy any of it, and all of that kind of stuff. I think that for those who've read the excerpt from Quintilian, I mean, it's a truly extraordinary passage when he talks about the grief at the loss of his son, and about how, he says literature alone can provide true solace and adversity and things like that. And I think there's a couple of ways to look at this. One is this sort of Woody Allen-esque, well, my body may be dead, but my work lives forever. And so that's a way of extending my existence well into the future, and therefore should be a consolation today. I certainly don't think that's going to do a lot for somebody who's lost a child. Maybe it can mitigate to some degree the fear that attends envisioning the final end of one's own life, but even that I think is arguable. But I think there's another thing built in here, and I guess I come at this again from kind of a practitioner's standpoint, but I used to work as a foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain, and whatever you might think about his politics, one of the things that he always sort of said that always stuck with me was that the true measure of a life is a life that's in where you serve a cause greater than your own self-interest. And for Quintilian, I think that the other way of viewing this is his literature is not just something that's going to live forever because it's a great work and therefore he's not totally gone, but rather he's living now a life of service to others through the literature he's producing, precisely this literature which he says he has no desire on his own to produce. He's doing it only for others. And so, what greater measure of a life can there be than to labor in service to others in a contribution that you can uniquely make that will benefit others over time. And that, I think, is a pretty profound point that's kind of buried in some of these words.
Fantastic. Yeah, I see some other folks are weighing in here with similar ideas. So again, this is a great strategy if you can do it, right? But what if you can't pull yourself together? This is where I want to get to a consolation that I did not assign beforehand, but I mentioned. This is Plutarch. So Plutarch was a writer who lived, he was almost the same age as Quintilian. I think he was 10 years older, wrote in Greek on the far side of the Roman Empire. He has a famous consolation to his wife, and this is terrible. Their 2-year-old daughter had died. It's very short. You could read this in any classroom. There are many good translations. There's some on the internet. And so let me just show you some of the passages. He's trying to talk about how to deal with grief in practical terms. So Plutarch was a bit of a philosopher, not one of the, but he always sort of was grounded in the real world. So here's what he has to say. It's very profound, some of this. He says, I observe that most mothers, after other people have cleansed and prettied up their children, receive them in their arms like pets. And then, at the death of those children, the mothers give themselves up to an unwarranted and ungrateful grief, not out of goodwill toward them, for goodwill is rational and right, but because the combination with a little natural feeling of a great deal of vain opinion makes their mourning wild, frenzied, and difficult to calm. So this is quite interesting. I underline a couple of phrases, and I just wonder what you think about some of these passages here. Right, I said well, let me just get to the slide where he explains, and then we'll do this maybe a couple more minutes. We'll hear from the audience and take some questions. But here's a strategy. He says, each person takes grief in of his own accord. But once grief has fixed itself with the passing of time and become his companion and household intimate, it will not quit him even at his earnest desire. We must therefore resist grief at the door and must not let it in to be quartered on us by wearing mourning or cropping the hair or any other manifestations of the kind that, confronting the mind daily and shaming it into submission, make it dispirited, cramped, shut in, deaf to all soothing influences, and a prey to vain terrors. He's saying you cannot allow yourself to grieve, only in a very short measure, because if you lock yourself into this state, you will never get out of it. You're going to start to neglect your dress, your hygiene. You will never move on with your life. So don't even allow the grieving process to go beyond a very measured, very dignified public display. So I wonder what people think. It might be about time. I see, yeah, we've only got about 15 minutes. We didn't really get to the Thanksgiving. We could talk about that, but I'd rather take questions and see if some of us, if we could think about some of these passages we've looked at. I'll show you one more from Plutarch and hear from some of you. Oh, yes, just quite the contrary, he says. In its own suffering, the soul should be held by a vigorous condition of the body. He's saying, don't grieve, get out there and exercise. Get dressed, put on nice clothes. I would recommend that Plutarch read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. That's her Stages of Denial, is that right? Stages of Dying, is that right? And I see some personal experience. Samuel says, I've experienced this myself through personal ordeals. Maybe you'd like to elaborate on that or ask us questions.
Mike,
Samuel,
I'd like to add,
go ahead.
Mike, I'd like to add a little bit of a clarification too. And as you've described and shared these passages, you and Richard have done a great job of sort of riffing with each other and being able to bring this and apply this, I think, as a lens to what we all go through. Much of it seems to be focused on the individual. Can you speak at all to the ways in which any of these writings or what you're familiar with might speak to collective loss or community grief? I've seen a lot of the comments in the chat box sort of acknowledge the sense that, you know, we're, as educators in particular, we're so dialed into a larger and oftentimes younger community. How does this apply to that context?
That's a great insight, Andy. I can speak to the ancient world. The literature that we have remaining, by and large, focuses entirely on the individual and trying to convince the individual in various ways, for better or worse, that you can get beyond this. You can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, so to speak. That said, within the lived world of Greece and Rome before Judaism and Christianity, the burial rituals were very important. The public burial in particular. There were professional mourners in ancient Greece. And I think, believe it or not, Richard and I grew up in New Orleans. There used to be something like this, at least when we were growing up. You could hire mourners for a funeral. I don't know if that still happens much in the world, but we definitely had that. And you could hire women to come in mourning dress and tear their cheek. They would scratch at their cheeks until they were bloody with their fingernails. And so there was a period of mourning. I'm not sure to what extent this is much in existence, these ritualized grieving processes. In Judaism, of course, this is still very much a thing, the sitting Shiva, where you spend a particular amount of time. In Islam, there's a set period, I believe, of bereavement. But it seems hit or miss in the modern context. What do you think, Richard?
Well, it's a good question. I think there's the collective aspect of grief and bereavement, and then there's a collective aspect of how one works through that emotional state. And I mean, part of what we were talking about at the beginning is the grief that so many people are feeling now, not just because of a particular individual loss, or even just as individuals, but because, you know, I mean, now we can quote John Donne, right? Who said, "No man is an island unto himself." You know, for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee, because he says, you know, he's part of the whole. We're all part of this, and so he grieves for any man's death for whom the bell tolls. And I think you actually can sense this now because, you know, I'm sure this is true of everyone else. You read these accounts of these heartbreaking accounts of people dying that you don't know, but you can imagine what they and their families have gone through. On top of this loss of a way of life and the uncertainty associated with, to the degree it's going to come back. And that's a collective kind of experience. I mean, you know, some people have written that right now we are going through the first global event ever in human history. You know, never has everyone gone through the same kind of thing all at once. And you know, grief is a pretty good example for what billions of people are feeling to greater and lesser degrees. So that's the experience, the sort of stimulus, to go back to the very beginning. And then there's the process by which we deal with that stimulus. And that, almost by definition, has to be collective. I mean, the idea of a one-person funeral doesn't make any sense, right? That the idea of I mean, the last thing that you think people want is when they're in distress is to just be by themselves and try to work through it. We have built thousands of years of rituals and processes and functions and patterns and norms, all designed to help people get through a grief and bereavement process, or through the loss of something dear to them, by interacting with other people. And yet today, that's a thing that's so interrupted. And so I think that actually compounds the sense of problems. I mean, the most heartbreaking thing you could ever read are some of these accounts in the New York Times and things like that, where somebody, had to say goodbye to their spouse who was, dying in the emergency room, and yet they weren't allowed to hold their hand because they were afraid they were going to catch coronavirus from, this person. So they had to say goodbye over FaceTime or something. I mean, it's hard to imagine, and that really gets at the thing that we lose when we can't have those collective physical and verbal interactions to help us process these emotions.
Thank you. And maybe even to ask for each of you or one of you to add a slightly finer point, grieving in some ways is a very isolating experience. And so I'm wondering if you can speak at all to the collective responsibility to actively reach out to comfort. We've talked a lot about consolation. What about comfort? What about the sort of community or family or individual responsibility to help others process their grieving?
So that's another great question, and it's not here, but Cicero, the same author that I've been quoting repeatedly, he wrote a fantastic book called On Duties. Now, On Duties was the second book printed in Europe after the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg, because it was considered such a wonderful book that it was a supplement to the Bible, even though Cicero died 40, 30 years before Jesus was born. It was considered that good, and most of the ethics will be familiar. And Cicero says repeatedly, we are not born for ourselves alone. He's quoting Plato, the philosopher, but he says, we didn't give birth to ourselves, right? We have duties to other people. Now, one thing he doesn't say much about is the kind of advice or the practices many of us are living through now, calling on a neighbor to go for a walk, or visiting the sick or the elderly. In part, in the ancient world, that would be because the elderly lived within the larger family unit. That's, in the United States, I think we get a more skewed view of this than most places in the world. But the personal relationships are inherent in everything they do. So it's not so much that he talks about the grieving process, as simply the constant relationships and duties we owe to other people at all times. What do you think, Richard?
Well, there's a question that you might want to tackle on Sappho's reflections on death and aging, and her work there, that you might want to take on, and then I might make a comment, but I see this in the chat box.
Here it is. Let me say, Ellen, this is Jasmine. Ellen Green speaks of Sappho's reflections on death and aging. It'd be interesting it would be interesting to hear you speak about Sappho's reflections of death in her work. I'm trying to think of the poem you're thinking of off the top of my head. For those who aren't familiar, Sappho was the first woman writer in the ancient world. She was the poetess of Lesbos, the island, and she wrote a number of times about love being like death. But I'm blanking on the exact passage, other than the one as love being akin to death. So if you could cue me up, I'd be happy to think about it, but I wouldn't want to just blow smoke about the wrong poem for you. I'm sorry.
And the comment, I guess, Alvin, there's a question here from Christina about Sherry Turkle's work, she's a professor at MIT and she wrote a book called The Second Self back in the mid 1980s. And her argument all the way back then was that computers and technology are not tools that we use. They actually become a part of our social lives, our psychological lives, that And I think that's pretty evident now that, I once read something asking, do you feel closer to your spouse or your smartphone? Who knows more about you, your spouse or your smartphone?
Google.
And it's a pretty good question. So, what we are, and to the point, to the comment that Christina's making, I mean, there are these virtual communities that have a character of their own. It's just not a replication of what would otherwise obtain in the non-virtual space. The point that I was going to make before, though, and this gets to, I think, part of the comfort thing, and of course, there are many different ways that you comfort someone who is bereaved, and it depends very much on what they are going through and how they deal with things like that. But this actually gets to teaching, which I think most of the folks on here do. And the sort of the mental tools that one brings to any experience is shaped so profoundly through what you've learned from your greatest teachers. I mean, consciously or subconsciously, I think I probably draw on what I learned in school and in college and in grad school every single day of my life, not just in the work context, but in the life context, as you go through life experiences. And so some of this comfort is almost a mental, packing your students' mental suitcases for that day when they have to pull out of that suitcase the thing that you've taught them to need, even if it's not directly related. And this gets back to kind of the literature, the time to read fiction is not in a crisis, it's before you get to a crisis, so that you can have that stretched mind, that nimbleness, those imaginations available to you when it's necessary. And, when you get back to these questions that Seneca and others are saying, I want to be immortal through my work, it's harder to think of any more profound service to others that truly will live beyond one's finite existence than the education of others who will then disperse to the four winds and take with them the insights and knowledge that one, as a professor, as a teacher, has helped provide them, that they will carry with them and potentially pass on beyond them as well. So I think teaching is a case in point here.
That's a fantastic insight about Quintilian, isn't it? Right? That hadn't occurred to me, that he's not just saying he's going to complete his work to complete writing a book, but he's going to write a book for education of young people. That's really good. Which is what we're doing here. I see a couple, as we are finishing, I'm seeing some awful things about people being more in love with their virtual online communities than their personal relationships. That sounds simply terrible. To the extent that that's happening, I'm sure it is. And then I see Christine mentioned the Sappho poem is the one about the death of Adonis. Yes, but I haven't read it, I think, since graduate school, and that was a long time ago. So I'm going to take a pass on that and simply encourage people to read it. I think we just have a second or two left. Are there any last questions or comments?
Mike and Richard, you've given us a lot to think about and shared many different passages with us. I know we didn't get to all of the PowerPoint, unfortunately, and we'll have to share this afterwards with our attendees. But I wonder if I can ask just one final question before we wrap up for the evening. And all these folks, all these educators are, again, immersed in the lives of young people. It seems to me to kind of bring us back full circle to where we began this conversation. We talked about ways in which fiction allow us to experience things, almost like training wheels. You can experience deep feelings, deep emotions, loss, betrayal, love, tragedy, yet you can also close the book and then use that as a lens maybe to understand the world that we're currently in. Mike, in your experience with the classics in particular, is there any sense of quality value of the grieving of the thing that you're grieving? And I to put this in a little finer context, all of the students that we work with, the children that we're raising, particularly older students are losing, with a snap of a finger, a lot of the things that we organize and anchor our lives to. It's not life or death. It's not loss of job, perhaps, but it is a massive disruption to the world as they knew it. And there's some grieving that goes to that. So I guess my hope and my question is to invite you to make us understand, to help us understand that grieving doesn't rely on what the thing is. In other words, the depth of your grieving can be just as important, even if it's not a life or death kind of situation. Did you find that the classics spoke of grieving in context that may not seem a life or death situation?
That's exactly right, Andy. So Cicero and the other philosophers, they say grief is the ultimate, but it's all of a similar kind, with grieving for all kinds of different things. So in the Tuscula Disputations, where I pulled some of those quotes, book 3 is all about grieving over death. Book 4 is about grieving over lesser matters. But they say now that you've understood how to cope with, that you've understood that, grieving for death, which is the worst case scenario, once you're past that, you can deal with these other issues in a simpler fashion, but analogous fashion. They don't go into much detail about career. The very next slide, I could show you this actually, as we're parting. Cicero, I think I pulled from it's not popping up here. Cicero had pulled, he mentions the case of a guy who had run for the consulship. He'd run for president basically, and he lost, and his grief just took over. And Cicero says he should have, and he says that he lost his life, and it's not clear whether this guy had a heart attack or he took his own life. But he is saying, losing basically the election to be president, that's pretty horrible. But the guy took it too far. He should have moderated his grief, and so the strategies are the same.
Yeah, and it certainly strikes me that one of the ways to process grieving is to understand that other human beings have also experienced deep loss and grieving all through time, thousands of years of examples, that we're not alone when we're facing these kinds of personal struggles. Mike Fontaine, Richard Fontaine, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to forward through those slides. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights with us. We appreciate you putting together these resources and readings. I do want to encourage all of our attendees to grab, if you can, with a cut and paste, much of the chat. I think both Michael and Richard were able to add some thoughts there as well. To the Fontaine boys, thank you again so much.
Thank you. It's been an honor.
Really enjoyed it, Andy.
Thanks, Mike. I do want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us tonight, spending some time at work after work. Please do follow the National Humanities Center for future opportunities. As a pop-up webinar tonight, we designed this on a fly. We probably put it together in 5 or 6 hours of communication in response to this new world that we're currently living in, and those kinds of opportunities do pop up. You'll get first to notice it, though, if you join our listserv, as many of you likely are, and follow us on social media. Both Facebook and Twitter are active and ongoing ways to see new and upcoming events. Our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday. It's actually the last webinar of the 2019-20 season. This will be number 40, and many of you have been with us for many of these sessions, so I hope you can join us for this last session. It's titled Pride and Prejudice in its Third Century. We'll be working with Nicholas Dames, Professor of Humanities at Columbia University. We will be announcing the 2020-2021 session lineup, the calendar soon, and then we'll talk to you about when you can sign up for next year's sessions. In just a moment, I'm going to open the post-webinar survey. Please take a few moments to complete it. When you do so, you'll receive an email that gives you the certificate for attendance. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day in your virtual school tomorrow. Please be well, and we'll see you next time in the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.